A high decibel, adrenaline-soaked morning at the tactical training range. Four elite squads are executing a complex, live-fire maneuver. The tempo is blistering. Dust and smoke choke the air. Standing at the edge of the perimeter is a young woman named Elena Ward. She is silent, holding nothing but a digital tablet. A sergeant, dripping with sweat and arrogance, laughs as he reloads. He looks at her and shouts, "Hey, send a real warrior to watch us. Not a student." Elena doesn't blink. She says nothing. But 3 minutes later, an emergency klaxon screams. The entire zone stops. Every eyes turns to her. Silence reigns. The high desert range of the Nellis complex was more than just a training ground. It was a graveyard of ambition. Here the sun didn't just shine, it scoured everything in its path, from the paint on the transport trucks to the morale of the youngest recruits. The air hung heavy with a toxic perfume of burnt cordite, diesel exhaust, and the sharp metallic tang of hot gun barrels cooling in the wind. In this hyper-masculine, high-stakes world of tactical training, status was a currency determined by the amount of red dirt etched into your face and the terrifying split-second speed of your draw. Specialist Elena Ward, 26 years old, appeared to have none of that currency. She stood at the very edge of the firing line, a figure of striking contrast against the rugged landscape. Her flight suit was perfectly pressed, devoid of the grease stains that marked the operators. Her hair was pulled back into a regulation bun, so tight and precise, it spoke of a discipline that no one on the range truly understood. While the soldiers around her were checking their plates and zeroing their optics with aggressive energy, Elena remained a statue of professional neutrality. Elena held the title of Safety Observer and Training Controller Support. To the frontline soldiers, it was a role viewed as a glorified babysitter or a necessary bureaucratic obstacle designed by people in air-conditioned offices. While the elite squads were practicing high-intensity room clearing and high-speed extractions, Elena was usually found standing in the deep shadows of the primary observation post, her eyes glued to a high-resolution tablet, tracking a river of telemetry and sensor data that most soldiers ignored in favor of their red dot sights. To her colleagues at the Range Control Center, she was the ghost in the back. She arrived 20 minutes before every shift to manually calibrate the lidar arrays and check the atmospheric sensors. She left long after the last brass casing had been swept into the recycling bins. She never joined the loud, boasting conversations in the mess hall about who had the tightest shooting groups or who had survived the most grueling deployments in the Hindu Kush. Her personnel file, sitting in a secure digital folder in the colonel's office, was sparse but carried an immense weight for those who knew how to read it. Registered nurse, Bachelor of Science, certified range safety officer, prior service medical logistics and tactical systems integration. To the SEAL teams and Ranger units rotating through the zone, however, she was a non-entity, a trainee in a uniform who was only there to tick boxes on a safety checklist and ensure the insurance paperwork was signed before the real work began. They saw her tablet as a toy and her silence as a lack of confidence. "She's a bit out of her depth, isn't she?" a junior lieutenant had asked during the 4 o'clock morning briefing, his voice dripping with casual condescension. "We're running Tier 1 kinetic scenarios today, high-speed, low-drag maneuvers that require absolute situational awareness. We need people who understand the push of a breach, the physics of a moving firefight." She looks like she belongs in a clinical medical library, not a live-fire sack where the air is full of lead. Elena had heard the comment through the thin, vibrating partition of the briefing room. She didn't flinch. She didn't feel the need to walk in and present her credentials. She had been trained in a different kind of intensity, one where ego was a liability and data was the only truth. She understood a reality the shooters often forgot in their adrenaline-fueled haze. In a high-speed system involving hundreds of moving parts and thousands of rounds of ammunition, the smallest human deviation is more lethal than an enemy bullet. She wasn't watching the soldiers' style, their aggressive posture, or the way they handled their recoil. She was watching the geometry of fire. She was calculating sectors of fire to the 10th of a degree, monitoring the heat signatures of light machine gun barrels through thermal overlays, and tracking the precise GPS coordinates of every man on the field down to the millimeter. She was a warrior of data, fighting a battle against entropy that the shooters couldn't even see. The mockery reached its inevitable peak during a transition phase of the mid-morning exercise. Sergeant Vance, a man with 3 combat tours, a chest full of medals, and an ego that required its own logistical support, had just finished a grueling 400-meter sprint under a full combat load. He was the lead hammer of Team Viper, a man who prided himself on being the loudest and the most aggressive force in any room. As he stepped back to hydrate, he saw Elena standing near the primary observation post. She was still silent, her expression neutral, her tablet glowing with the blue and red icons of the tactical overlay. To Vance, her presence was an insult to the purity of the training. He felt the need to assert his dominance over the outsider who dared to grade his performance from the safety of the perimeter. "Hey, specialist!" Vance shouted, his voice booming across the range, cutting through the hum of the generators. He made sure he was loud enough for his entire squad to stop and listen. He wiped a streak of grease paint and sweat from his forehead with a gloved hand. "If you want to learn how real men work, why don't you come a little closer? Put down the iPad and get some dirt on those boots. Otherwise, go back to the air-conditioned office and send us a real warrior. We're doing grown-up work today. You're just cluttering up the scenery and taking up space where a shooter should be." The squad laughed. A few people smirked, looking away to hide their amusement. Elena didn't respond. She didn't defend her rank, she didn't mention her years of medical experience, and she didn't show even a flicker of anger in her eyes. She simply adjusted her noise-canceling headset, tapped a command on her screen to refresh the lighter sweep, and looked back at her telemetry. She had noticed something on the tactical overlay, a ghost of a signal, a microscopic timing error in the movement of Team Viper's flankers that was beginning to ripple through the entire formation like a crack in a windshield. She wasn't interested in Vance's ego. She was interested in the mathematical fact that his squad was drifting toward a catastrophe. In her world, the real warrior was the one who kept everyone alive to fight the next day. If you think people often underestimate roles they don't understand, comment, "It's unfair." The exercise resumed with an even higher level of intensity. The 4 elite squads were now moving through a simulated urban environment, a complex, sprawling maze of reinforced concrete walls and multi-story plywood structures. They were using live ammunition to clear multiple objectives simultaneously, a maneuver that required absolute synchronization. On the surface, it was a masterpiece of military precision, a high-speed ballet of steel, smoke, and coordinated aggression. Team Viper, led by Sergeant Vance, was tasked with suppressing the northern flank with heavy fire, while Team Cobra moved into the primary breach of the target building. The coordination seemed flawless to the untrained eye. The rhythmic thunder of the rifles created a wall of sound that vibrated through the ground, and the communication over the tactical net was short, sharp, and professional. But Elena saw the drift. On her tablet, the LiDAR scan, a laser-based system that mapped the environment and the personnel in real time, was painting a terrifyingly different picture. The blue icons representing Team Viper were moving 3.2 degrees wider than the authorized path. It was a microscopic error, a difference of maybe 4 feet on the actual ground. In a world of mountains and valleys, 4 feet is nothing. In a live-fire urban training zone, 4 feet is the distance between a successful, suppressive fire and a blue-on-blue tragedy. To Sergeant Vance and his men, the movement felt right. They were finding better cover from the sun's glare. They were adapting to the jagged piles of debris on the canyon floor. They felt like warriors making split-second tactical decisions based on the feel of the dirt. They were operating on instinct, but instinct is a dangerous guide when the margins are measured in inches. Elena was looking at the full system. She saw that Team Cobra, fueled by a competitive urge to beat Viper's previous time, was also moving ahead of schedule. Their breach was too fast. The timing of the suppression and the entry were falling out of sync by fractions of a second. If this continued, Team Viper's suppressive fire, heavy 5.56 rounds capable of punching through multiple layers of plywood and drywall, would soon overlap with Team Cobra's entry point. The environment was also conspiring against them. The barometric pressure was shifting, and the desert wind was picking up, gusting from the west at 15 knots. Elena checked her anemometer readings. The wind was pushing the trajectory of Viper's rounds further toward the center of the zone, right into the path of the entry team. The thermal sensors on her screen showed that the structural integrity of the target building was already weakening from the intense volume of fire. Viper lead, this is control support, Elena said into the tactical net. Her voice was a calm, flat frequency that didn't carry the rookie tremor they expected. It was a voice designed to cut through the noise without adding to the panic. Check your western boundary. You are drifting into Sector B4. Correct your heading by 4 degrees east immediately to maintain safety margins. Do you copy? Negative, Control. Vance's voice crackled back, dripping with irritation and the supreme arrogance of a man who thought he knew the dirt better than a digital screen. We have better visual here on the ground. The wind is a non-factor for our optics. Stay off the net unless it's a medical emergency specialist. We're in the middle of a hot run for certification. Don't clutter the frequency with your theoretical checklists. We're winning this one. Elena didn't argue. In the world of range control, an argument was a waste of precious seconds that could be used for a solution. She began a safety convergence calculation, a complex algorithm that projected the movement paths of both teams 30 seconds into the future. She factored in the wind speed, the rate of fire from the M249s, and the deteriorating structural integrity of Target 3. The result appeared as a red flashing box on her tablet. At current speeds and headings, Team Viper would be firing directly into the primary exit path of Team Cobra as they emerged from the structure. It was the butterfly effect of tactical medicine. A small, ego-driven choice on the flank was creating a lethal crossfire in the center. The warriors on the ground were blind to it. They were focused on their front sights, their designated targets, their own surging adrenaline. They were in the zone, but the zone was a hall of mirrors. They couldn't see the walls they were building for themselves out of their own overconfidence and their disdain for the observer in the back. Elena stood silently on the ridge. She was the only person in the entire 10-square-mile training complex who could see the tragedy before it happened. She saw the lighter lines crossing like the blades of a pair of scissors. She saw the thermal blooms of the rifles lining up with the biological heartbeats of the entry team. She waited 5 more seconds, giving Vance one last chance to see the physical boundary marker she had signaled on his HUD. He didn't look at his display. He pushed further into the forbidden sector, shouting for his men to pour it on and empty the belts. The risk was no longer theoretical. It was a mathematical certainty of death. Elena's hand hovered over the override button, her heart rate steady at 60 beats per minute while the world around her was exploding. If you realize small details can signal bigger risks, comment, I was wrong. The convergence was reaching its critical point, the moment where physics overrides intent. Team Cobra was stacking at the rear door of the primary objective, their bodies tensed for the flashbang entry. They were a single cohesive unit of 6 men, ready to burst into a dark room. 50 yards away, Team Viper was laying down a continuous wall of lead. Their barrels were glowing white-hot in the thermal spectrum on Elena's tablet. Because of the drift and the western gust, the safety margin, the no-fire buffer zone, had evaporated entirely. The rounds were striking the plywood walls of Target 3 at an angle that was causing them to tumble and fragment. Elena saw the Cobra lead raise his hand, the universal signal for the 3-second countdown. In 5 seconds, 6 elite operators would step into a space that was currently being shredded by the heavy weapons of their own squad mates. It was a textbook blue on blue in the making, a tragedy of errors fueled by the very aggression the unit was so proud of. This was the moment that defined a real warrior. In Elena's mind, it wasn't about the ability to pull a trigger or the strength to carry a pack. It was about the iron courage to stop when the world was screaming for more speed. Elena didn't hesitate. She didn't call the tower commander for permission. She didn't try to politely suggest a correction one last time. She reached for the primary console on her tactical belt, a device she had tested and retested 3 times that morning, the Master Safety Override. It was a high-priority encrypted signal that bypassed every tactical radio, every civilian cell phone, and every electronic ear protection device in the zone. Wah! Ah! The safety klaxon erupted across the entire training zone. It was a piercing, soul-shaking sound, a 120 decibel scream of electronic warning that forced every nervous system in the area to freeze in a primitive survival response. It was the God voice of the range, the sound that meant the laws of the exercise had been suspended. All stations, cease fire! Cease fire! Cease fire! Elena's voice was no longer quiet or unassuming. It was a resonant, commanding frequency that boomed through every headset in the zone, overriding all other communications with a hardwired priority. Freeze in place, lock your weapons. Training halted. Repeat, training halted. All personnel remain at current coordinates. The silence that followed was heavy and toxic. The thunder of the rifles died instantly, replaced by the ringing in the soldiers' ears and the sound of settling dust. Sergeant Vance stood in the red dirt, his rifle still smoking, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of crimson beneath the grime. He looked up toward the observation ridge, his chest heaving with frustrated adrenaline. "What the hell is this? Ward!" Vance screamed, his voice cracking with rage. "You just ruined a $3 million certification exercise. We were at the door. We were seconds from the objective. Why did you pull the plug on a perfect run? You're done, Specialist. I'm going to make sure you never step foot on a range again." The range commander, Colonel Thorne, a gray-haired veteran who had been watching the telemetry from the primary tower, descended the steel stairs and walked onto the field. His face was a mask of unreadable stone. Behind him, the safety officers from Team Cobra were also emerging from the shadows of the structures, looking confused and ready for a fight. "Who called the override?" the colonel barked, his voice echoing off the concrete walls like a hammer on an anvil. Elena stepped down from her observation post. She didn't run, she didn't look scared or defensive. She walked with a rhythmic, grounded pace toward the center of the field, her tablet held firmly in her hand. The warriors stood in a circle around her, their glares focused on the silent girl who had just humiliated the most elite unit on the base. "I did, sir," Elena said, standing at attention before the colonel. Her eyes never left his, showing a level of composure that made Vance's shouting look like a child's tantrum. "Explain yourself, Specialist," the colonel said, his voice low and dangerous. "You know the consequences of a false stop during a Tier 1 certification. You have 30 seconds before I have you escorted from the range." Elena didn't give a speech about her feelings. She didn't mention Vance's earlier mockery or the fact that he had called her a student. She simply held up her tablet and tapped a quick sequence of keys. A holographic replay of the last 90 seconds projected into the dusty air between them, pulled directly from the LiDAR and thermal sensor arrays. Team Viper drifted 4.2 feet into Sector B4 due to improper boundary recognition on the western ridge, Elena briefed. Her voice was clinical, precise, unstoppable. At the same time, Team Cobra accelerated their breach by 12 seconds to compensate for the dust. Had Team Cobra exited the structure on their primary signal, they would have entered the direct, overlapping line of fire of Viper's M249s. The margin of safety was -0. The structural material of Target 3 was already failing under the drift fire. "I exercised my authority as safety controller to prevent a mass casualty event. The data is verified by the range's internal sensors." The colonel looked at the projection. He saw the red kill zone where the digital bullets would have met the heart signatures of the entry team. He saw the drift that Vance had ignored. He saw the 12-second timing error that would have turned a breach into a massacre. The silence in the zone shifted. It was no longer a silence of anger. It was a silence of staggering, bone-chilled realization. The real warriors realized they had been seconds away from killing their own brothers. If you believe stopping at the right moment takes more courage than pushing forward, comment, "I owe you." The colonel watched the holographic loop for another 30 seconds. His jaw set so tight the muscles in his neck were bulging. He looked at the data, then he looked at the plywood door of Target 3. He then turned slowly to Sergeant Vance, who was still holding his rifle, though the muzzle was now pointed at the dirt. "Vance," the colonel said, his voice quiet but carrying the force of a landslide. If Specialist Ward hadn't pulled that klaxon, you would be writing 6 letters to 6 families tonight. You were blind. You were arrogant. And in any real-world theater, you would be dead, along with your entire team. You failed the boundary check 3 times. You ignored a direct safety correction from control. Your ego almost turned this range into a morgue. Vance's head dropped. The heavy hitter had lost his voice. The grime on his face seemed to turn gray under the desert sun. His squad members looked at the ground, unable to meet the colonel's eyes. The pride that had been so loud just minutes ago was now a heavy, suffocating shame. The colonel turned back to Elena. He didn't offer a handshake. That wasn't the protocol on the range. But he did something far more significant. He snapped his heels together and offered Elena a single sharp professional nod, a gesture of absolute respect that carried more weight than any medal. "Good call, Specialist," the colonel said, his tone softening just a fraction. "Your situational awareness is the only reason this exercise isn't a headline in tomorrow's paper. Your data interpretation was flawless. Get back to your post and prepare the full incident report. We'll restart the certification in 60 minutes after a full boundary debrief and a psychological reset for Team Viper. Sergeant Vance, you are relieved of lead for the next run. You will shadow Specialist Ward and learn how to actually read a sector." Elena didn't celebrate. She didn't look at Vance with a told-you-so expression or a smirk of triumph. She didn't feel the need to rub it in. She simply nodded back to the colonel, her expression as neutral and professional as it had been at the 4 o'clock briefing. "Yes, sir. Resetting the arrays now." As she walked back toward the observation ridge, the atmosphere in the zone had permanently changed. The air felt lighter, yet more serious. The soldiers weren't laughing anymore. They weren't whispering about the girl in the back or the babysitter. They were checking their GPS boundaries with a new kind of intensity. They were looking at their maps and realizing that their physical strength and their expensive gear were useless without the intellectual discipline to manage them. Vance stood by his squad, his face pale beneath the smoke and dirt. He waited until the colonel had walked back to the tower. Then he slowly walked over to the edge of the perimeter where Elena was resetting her equipment. He didn't say a word at first. He just stood there looking at the silent girl who had held his life, his squad's lives, and his honor in her hands while he was busy mocking her. "Specialist," Vance said, his voice low and devoid of its usual aggressive bark. He sounded tired, and for the first time, he sounded human. Elena stopped cleaning her tablet screen and looked at him. "Sergeant?" I was wrong," Vance whispered. He looked at the tablet, then back at her steady eyes. "I was looking for a warrior in the dirt. I was looking for someone who looked like me and talked like me. I didn't realize the most dangerous, most capable person on this range was the one standing behind the screen, seeing the things I was too proud to notice. Thank you for the stop. I owe you everything." Elena didn't give him a hard time. She understood that his arrogance was a byproduct of the pressure he was under. She also knew that he would never make that mistake again. "Just do the work, Sergeant. Keep your boundary at 4.2 degrees. I'm still watching. I'm always watching." She turned back to her work. She returned to the shadows of the post. She returned to being the invisible pillar that held the entire complex together. The rookie was gone. In her place was an anchor, a person who could see through the smoke, the ego, and the noise to find the singular truth of the mission. If you believe doing the right thing matters more than proving a point, comment, "I will live honorably." In our modern, loud world, we are conditioned from a young age to value the push. We are taught that strength is found in aggression, in being the fastest, the loudest, and the most visible person in the room. We confuse volume with value and motion with progress. We assume that the person at the edge of the action, the one who observes, the one who measures, the one who warns, is somehow less important than the person in the center of the fire. But the story of Elena Ward is a powerful, enduring reminder of a deeper truth that our society often forgets. True strength is often silent. It is not found in the weapon you carry or the medals on your chest. It is found in the depth of your preparation, in the clarity of your observation, and in the iron courage to say no when everyone else is screaming for more speed. It is the ability to see the drift, the small errors in judgment, the tiny deviations in character, before they become a disaster that destroys lives. Elena didn't defeat the SEALs or humiliate the sergeant because she wanted power or fame. She saved them from themselves. She understood that a system, whether it's a tactical team, a massive corporation, or a family, is only as strong as its weakest link. And often, the weakest link isn't a lack of equipment or training. It's the ego of the leaders and the blindness of the experts. She chose to be the discipline that the system lacked. When you look at your own life, your job, your family, your community, remember the silent observer. Remember that the person you might be dismissing as insignificant, just support, or the quiet one, might be the very person who is currently holding your entire world together. They are the ones who catch the errors in the contracts before they are signed. They are the ones who notice the subtle change in a friend's voice that signals a cry for help. They are the anchors that prevent the drift. Respect isn't given to the title on your door or the dirt on your face. It's given to the integrity you show when the stakes are high and no one is watching. Justice isn't a headline or a parade. It's the quiet moment when excellence is finally recognized for what it truly is. The ultimate responsibility. Always look deeper. Always value the quiet professional who does the homework while others are making noise. Because one day you'll find yourself moving too fast. Your boundaries will begin to drift in the wind of your own pride. And you'll find yourself praying for someone like Elena Ward to step out of the shadows and pull the plug before you hit the wall. Be that person. Be the calm in the storm. Be the warrior who knows that sometimes the most powerful and courageous thing you can do for your team is to make them stop. Because in the end, it's not the one who finishes first who wins. It's the one who brings everyone home. If you believe real strength is knowing when to stop and protect everyone around you, leave a comment below. And if this story reminds you that the quiet observers often see what others miss, don't forget to subscribe for more.